Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, und herzlich willkommen am Hamburger Institut für Sozialforschung für schon wieder die vorletzte Vorlesung in der Vorlesungsreihe Im Nebel des Krieges. Den Rest des Abends wird auf Englisch stattfinden, deswegen werde ich auch bald wechseln. Wenn Sie Fragen haben, ich glaube, das ist auch auf Deutsch, nachher ist auch Fragen auf Deutsch möglich. Ja, sehr sicher. So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, at the Hamburg Institute for Social Research for the second to last already presentation in the lecture series, or lecture in the lecture series, In the Fog of War. Throughout this lecture series, perhaps inspired by current affairs taking place in Ukraine and currently also in Gaza, we have tried, as an Institute for Fundamental Social Research, we have tried to take a step back and to look critically at the role of war in contemporary society in Germany, Europe, and beyond, and also especially the role of war in the social sciences. Now, today's lecture by Dr. Valeria Lazarenko will be a bit special because it is indeed a lecture that is about the war in Ukraine. So we go back to the very fact that inspired this lecture series to begin with. And it's also perhaps a little bit going to be more special because it will be, in a sense, hands-on. It will really go to the question of how can you do research as a social researcher in the context of war. What are the ethical and the methodological implications of being literally in the middle of it? Then I will now continue with presenting the background, the fascinating background of our speaker of tonight, and then I'll hand the floor straight away. So, Dr. Valeria Lazarenko is Ukrainian and has studied in Kiev, more specifically at the Kiev National Taras Shevchenko University. By training, she is mainly a psychologist, bachelor with honors in psychology, master with honors in social psychology, and eventually a thesis at the Research Institute for Social and Political Psychology. Afterwards, she has been active with a Ukrainian think tank, which is called CEDOS, and that should translate to something like the Center for Research and Society. However, since the beginning of the war, Dr. Lazarenko has come to Germany and has been active first at the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space, then at the Freie Universität Berlin, and currently at the Humboldt-Universität Berlin, at the Georg Simmel Center for Metropolitan Studies. So we have a psychologist come urban studies expert. At the same time, Dr. Lazarenko has several publications on migration and on the diaspora of Ukrainians in Germany and in Europe, but also, of course, on studying Ukraine also in this period, this particular period of war, which is our main interest of today. Finally, Dr. Lazarenko has had several research days, mostly in Central and Northern Europe, Norway, Austria, Switzerland, no, Sweden come to mind. Now we will hand over the floor. The format of tonight is really that Dr. Lazarenko gives a longer presentation, probably 45 minutes, and then towards the end of the presentation, we will hand over to you, to the floor, to really go in conversation with Dr. Lazarenko. We aim to finish by 8:30 at the latest. Thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Lazarenko to take the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure for me to be here in Hamburg for the second time in 2 years as I am staying in Germany. And I have been before in the Helmut Schmidt Academy for I don't remember the German name, also with the same topic, but 2 years ago. And with the first reflections about the research, I'm going to talk about more today. And today I will present my findings and the outcomes of a paper that I have recently published with my colleague Marnie Howlett from the University of Oxford about ethical, methodological, and epistemological considerations on how to produce knowledge about the ongoing war in Ukraine, because we both have Ukrainian backgrounds, and the war was a life-changing event for both of us, and we reflected also on the many other research which is now being created and all the knowledge created around this war. And I will speak more about that, but also to speak a bit more about myself. When the war started on the 24th, in the morning of 24th February 2022, I was sleeping at home, at my home in Kiev, in Ukraine, and I woke up from the explosions. I remember this day as it was yesterday. And of course, the first days of war were extremely challenging for all of us, and also for our team in SEDO think tank in Ukraine. And before that, literally the day before the outbreak of the war, I was having a meeting with my team on the project we were doing about the social housing for homeless people in Ukraine. And suddenly, just the next day, our project, what we were doing, became absolutely irrelevant, because suddenly, not out of sudden, but still, so many millions of people in the country became almost homeless that, yeah, the topic just stopped being relevant. And at some point in the first day of the full-scale war, our team chat on Facebook turned from being a team chat to more like a support chat from the colleagues. We were checking on each other, just asking what's going on. But at some point, I was out of the internet because I was in a bomb shelter when there was an air raid alert. I came out of the bomb shelter and have seen that in the chat, my colleagues are discussing some research. I tried to look through what's going on, and then it happened without me. I just knew that, I just realized that I was appointed as a head of the project on researching the current experiences, the current situation. Because as a team of researchers, my colleagues came up with the idea that the best we as researchers can do now is to capture the current situation. Because what is happening now in the society on that days, of the first days of the full-scale war, is also kind of unique experience, and we somehow felt that we must fix it. And so we created a research, which then became a starting point for me thinking about how actually to do research. And I'll tell about this a bit later. And yes, after that, many things happened while we were doing this research, because all the team members were scattered around Ukraine. Someone was evacuating, someone was in the basement, someone was hiding somewhere, some was evacuating abroad. All the things happened to the team, but we somehow managed to do this research and to reflect on it later on. And so, yes, as millions of people have been displaced and grassroots situations fundamentally changed, accessing people's sites and materials of the research has become exceptionally complicated, and many topics have also become temporarily irrelevant or inappropriate, like our research on homeless people, or what I know from my other Ukrainian colleagues, their project just, became irrelevant for obvious reasons. But also, the interest of the world community to Ukraine sparkled a lot, and lots of new research were produced. Some of them in a very ad hoc manner, very fast, and as a response to what is going on. Much of social science research has continued since Russia's invasion in attempt to uncover the full experience of the war, but also I'll be coming back to the point that we must carefully interrogate the politics of knowledge production. And by knowledge production, I mean the conglomerate of research, publication, citation, teaching, policy engagement, and public engagement that we as social scientists are doing in our daily life. And I will use the examples of the two research that I have been doing in the past 2 years. First one, the one we have done with SEDOS research think tank, Kiev-based think tank. The research that we constructed somehow with our phones from the bomb shelters and evacuation trains. So we wanted to focus on the impact the war has on civilian population, and we aimed at documenting people's experiences, thoughts and feelings during the first days of the full-scale war. That was the initial idea. And the time framing for that research was quite, I would say, to me, when I look back to that experience, it looks even impressive that we managed to come up with a survey and to start to publish it for the first start collected data on 2nd of March. So like 10 days after the outbreak of the war. And we stopped collecting the data on the 7th of March because the situation was unfolding so quick that the experiences in 5 days could be very different. And in these 5 days of collecting information, we closed our form on 555 respondents who took part in the survey. The thing was that this survey, I call it survey, even though methodologically it's not like that a bit, actually it was a Google form. Because in that time, we didn't have much time to do any validation, any things to make this research methodologically rigorous. We just wanted to capture these experiences as it felt as a right thing to do at that moment. And yeah, so of course, our research was not representative, and we could only reach those people who had access to social media, who firstly were on social media, and secondly had access to the internet and because of electricity shortage and everything. And after that, we repeated the surveys. We changed the questions a bit, of course, but anyway, we did the follow-up 3 months from the beginning, 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years. The last one, I wasn't a part of that project anymore, but anyways, these results exist. So this is the one thing I will be referring to. And the second thing will be references to my ongoing research project that I'm doing at Georg Simmel Center for Urban Studies in Humboldt University of Berlin. This is more an anthropological project where I try to explore how and why Ukrainian refugee women make decisions to remain in Germany in a long-term perspective with a focus on the city of Berlin. Because we all know the situation and policies and practices in different federal states of Germany are different, so I can, with my limited resources, I can only focus on Berlin. And in this project, I focus on the individual trajectories of 12 Ukrainian single women who migrated to Berlin in February, April 2022. And I started working on this project in June 2022 and plan to finish it next year. And I do several thematic foci, bureaucracy, housing, and anchoring in urban context. But I'll not share the results of these projects today, maybe in the Q&A session a bit, but we'll mostly focus on the key challenges that I, as a researcher, as a social scientist, I face. Mostly the ethical responsibilities of academics when researching traumatic events, methodological deliberations involved in collecting data in dynamic and time-sensitive environments and ensuring critical, rigorous, and transparent research, because it is, to me, this methodological challenge, of course, it sounds the most boring, but anyway, it's the most important to me to reflect on how do we balance things, how do we, later, and the epistemological position of us as researchers producing knowledge about a lived reality from which we are some kind of removed, because, yeah, it is a personal challenge to research something which is so personally important, so much of a lived experience to you that you cannot not do it at the moment. And I'll start with ethical challenges, which are, of course, coming from the basic question, is it ethical to research the war while it is still going? Is it ethical to ask people the questions about the event that are potentially traumatic to it? And is it also ethical for us as researchers who experience this war to do a research? Because of course we are biased with our experience, with our emotional response to the situation. But the point for me, because for now I identify mostly not even as a social scientist, but as anthropologist. And for us in anthropology, yes, the emotions matter a lot. And especially the emotions of the researchers, what we feel while we are doing this. And it is also a subject to reflect. And to start with, I have a quote of Lee and Fuji here, an anthropologist, about the fact that we must remind ourselves that to enter another's world as a researcher is a privilege, not a right. And this was a point that was guiding me a lot and is guiding me a lot while I'm approaching my informants, or better to say research partners in the ongoing project with Ukrainian refugee women in Berlin, because I'm thinking a lot about what is my position, because yes, I'm a researcher and I understand why I'm doing this, and that yes, I ask my informants about their experiences, for instance, with German bureaucracy, that I can later on do some policy papers and be an advisor to the Senate of Berlin on the issues of refugee participation. So I know why I am doing, and that this potentially can impact and improve the policies and have a big outreach. But it is also my privilege that I can reach out to these people and use their stories into producing the knowledge about the subject, which might be, quite sensitive for them. And here comes a topic of who am I as a researcher, as a Ukrainian in Berlin, while entering the worlds of other people who are the same gender, the same probably age, the same social, not social strata, no, but with kind of similar background to me. Of course, I am an insider for these people. I'm someone like them, which helps me a lot in establishing the contact with them and going into this world, but also make me very biased of this and make my experience somehow shape the interviews and the conversations. And for instance, in political sciences, when I was having my internship at the Center for Peace Studies in Norway, in University of Tromsø, we were taught specifically that in political science, and especially in international relations, it is not like forbidden, but almost forbidden to do the research on the topic which is relevant to you. And they advise the researchers to deal with the, for instance, our context, not your country of origin, not your community of origin, but something different. And what am I doing is kind of the opposite. And the same with the research we did in CEDOS. We were actually inside the situation, we were experiencing this situation, and we were researching it, writing about it, working on it as a team of people experiencing different things, but all being the insiders. And yes, the question here is how to avoid the blind spots in investigations while we are insiders. And of course, I'll come back to this point later. The only answer can be the collaborative knowledge production, maybe with the colleagues from other countries who have their other perspectives. And but how to ensure this in the middle of the war, that's the question. And yeah, that's what I was talking about that because we can relate, we as researchers can relate with the experience of our informants, research partners, we can get better understanding, but the sentiments and feelings might hardly be separated from the research field. As an example from our research project in CEDOS, what we were doing and what was my biggest concern as a project leader was do the people in my team, how do they feel about what we are researching? Because in that survey, we had questions, we had thematic questions about, just direct questions about how do you feel? What were your first thoughts when the war has started? What were your first actions when the war has started? How your worldviews have changed in the last couple of weeks? And also the questions about moving, evacuating, moving from one place to another. And the thing that we try to manage in our team, because in that team, I was the only one with psychological education. My colleagues were coming from not only social science, but also philosophy, history backgrounds, and whatsoever, who were just there. We didn't receive specific training on how to do the research about the war. We just started doing it without reflecting on it at the first point. And then doing this research from the scratch, we were talking about this. What can we do? How can we cross-reference each other? How can we peer review each other's work? And how can we avoid re-traumatization of ourselves while doing the analytical work? And not only the analytical work, but it came later with also presenting the results and doing the outreach of the results. Because it can be also challenging, which was my experience when I was presenting this one research about the first day of full-scale war. When I arrived in Germany, I was asked to present this research in many contexts, and every time I was coming back to my experience of that days, which of course were not pleasant, but that was a part of my job, and I had to separate my professional self from my personal self. And that's not easy. But also another point is about how to build trust and rapport with your informants. Actually, how to engage people to share their stories, to share their experience, like we had with this Google form, and it was Google form with open questions. How do we collect the information? And the thing is that in theory of how to do social science, it is often regarded that conflict environments create challenges for recruitment and sampling, and this population is hard to reach. But in our case, it was the opposite. We had lots of attention to our survey, and then we had the last question, the last window in the Google form was, you can share all of your thoughts here with us, and some amount of people have shared with us that they were actually happy to participate in this research, because being able to focus on something for 20 minutes when the whole world is falling apart was kind of a small coping mechanism that was also helpful for them. And participating in research can also be a thing for research participants to feel empowered because their voice matters and someone wants to listen to their stories. What I do in my ongoing projects, I just approached my Ukrainian counterpartners and asked them to complain to me about German bureaucracy or about housing markets in Berlin. And yes, people are happy to complain, and especially when someone is paying attention to their complaints, it just works like that. And this is their way to be heard. But also there is another point about reaching out to the broader audience. is a question of mistrust. What we had a lot with our Google form were the comments, but why do you collect this information? For whom you are working? Who is financing you? And of course, when it is the beginning of the full-scale war and we ask people to describe how do they evacuate from their places, we didn't think about that. It just came as a back thought that, yes, maybe we are spying and we are just, collecting information about the routes and travels, which can be dangerous. And that's totally understandable. Another example is from my Ukrainian colleagues in colleagues in Berlin who are doing a research on Ukrainians. And they also made a survey on Facebook where people could choose the language in which they want to participate in research. It could be English, could be Ukrainian, could be Russian. Because people who were doing this survey, they like, yes, Ukrainians speak Russian. Yes, we speak Russian, but when we see that the survey can be filled in Russian, this creates some levels of mistrust. And the only way to do it is to do the communication about the research as open as we could, just put everything in the disclaimers, explain our informants how we are going to use the data. But also, one of the things is about anonymization and telling some things off the record. And in case of my interview projects, some of the people from the beginning told me that they will share their experience, but only in case I will not be recording them, because they were fully aware that some of the things they are doing, it's better not to say it on the record. So, so I communicate this thing all the time, even though it's not that easy for me to remember and do all the field notes just immediately after the interview, because the interview can last for 4 hours sometimes. But that's the only way to ensure the participant that they are actually in charge of their story and what they share, and make them feel seen, heard, and empowered. But also, the ethical considerations are not only about our participants, but also ourselves as a researcher. What I was mentioning about navigating my team, and one of the doing the peer reviewing, collaborative projects, but also delegating tasks and dividing challenging topics across the team. For instance, in my team, we did it like that. I knew personal situations of every, besides me, there were 7 other people. I knew their personal situations and delegated the task that way, not to reinforce the trauma, because the questionnaire included around, I don't remember, hard to recall now, but we divided the question that way. So like a person who had the experience of crossing the border, a traumatic experience of evacuation from Ukraine, not deal with set of questions on this topic, and vice versa. And of course, what we accidentally created in our team was creating safe spaces for team members to debrief and discuss the challenging aspects. So it somehow just happened organically, but now I think that it is probably what all the research teams should do all the time, because as we researchers inside the war can experience it very hardly. So we just had Friday meetings when we were drinking tea together and talking how the process is going and what can we do better. And afterwards, at some point, we secured the professional support and a psychologist who was working with us as a team for the debriefing and just managing all this emotionally charging information. So it's about navigating the war-life balance, and while simultaneously being also, while remaining kind to ourselves and not to try to push too much on ourselves, because this is a thing of being disappointed about not producing enough knowledge, not doing enough with our research, and that's, of course, we can do better, but yeah. Second part, methodological challenges. I will be quite brief here at this point. That the main thing for me is the balance between actually the issue of time. How much time do we have to ensure that the research instruments, like surveys, questionnaires, are good enough, rigorous enough, and before the time context can happen? And what is the right time to do the research? And also an example from German academia and German practice. In Germany, here, to do any kind of research, we need to have an approval from the ethical committee. In case of Humboldt University, ethical committee has a meeting every 2 months. So if I want to do something, I need to apply for and wait for a month for them to decide that, yes, this research can be good. But when the context is changing so fast, we just don't have time, and we had the privilege of being an NGO think tank that we just could pass it without an ethical committee. In some countries, it can be a challenge, and this is the experience of my colleague, Marnie Hollett, who actually, when she received the feedback from the ethical committee that she can do that research, the questions in there were not relevant anymore, and she had to wait for another round of approval of the next survey of the ethical committee. But also, the ethical committees, if we are Ukrainian researchers based somewhere in the outer world, here in German or European context, it is one thing because, like, ethical committee usually consists of people who are from another context, and they might assess the questionnaire as okay and suitable, while the actual testing the research instruments with people who experienced the war will make them cry from the first question. That's also real stories of my colleagues. So sensitivity and these things should be, of course, balanced very well, and it is a huge challenge for researchers. Another thing is, I think I'll skip that one. And yeah, focus on this. Also, imagine having a research with more than 500 answers, and you need to write a report to present it to the general public, like we had in our SEDO think tank. We cannot include all the answers, and we also cannot generalize them. What we can do is to include the quotes to highlight some of the experiences. So here comes the questions. Which quotes do we include? And whose voices are included, whose voices are missing, and who we do not represent. Because as not only as academic scientists, but like public scientists, like NGO think tank, and our audience, our readership was not inside the academia, but also just interested parties of the society, it is quite a thing of what do we include? How do we shape our report? And aren't we biased in highlighting some voices that we want to be heard and some voices that we do not want to be heard? And here comes a very tricky topic of what are we doing with our research? Are we doing self-censorship in certain attempts, which is obviously not a good thing to do, but this is what my colleagues in SEDAS have done with a very touching topic of when they repeated the research 1 year after the beginning of the full-scale war. There was a question of what are you scared now the most? And lots of people were actually answering that they are scared of being mobilized to the army, which is a fear among certain part of the community. But there were discussions in the team. Should we include this? Or how will the society benefit from that? Because this topic in Ukrainian society is kind of wavy and it changes over the time. But yeah, this is a fear which is at the same time not creating that much positive image of the country and of the whole situation. And how do we contribute with this knowledge that we produced by our research to the general situation of the society. And same thing with my anthropological research. I don't have space to present when I'm lecturing or when I'm writing. I don't have a space to present all the 12 life trajectories that are very different. Which one do I choose to focus on to illustrate some things? And how do I deal with some things that are like not that much complementary for, could be not that much complementary for Ukrainian society? For instance, if the person is telling me off the record the story of how she is, how to say, tricking with the social benefits she's receiving, because people do that. And it is one story of 12. But should I speak about that or should I not? Because one thing is if I write about this in academic journals. The other thing is when I write about this for a column in Die Zeit, which might have other readership and other impact. And of course, I, as a Ukrainian, don't want the German society to think of Ukrainians badly. So, yeah, that's what I'm trying to balance with presenting the voices of my informants in different ways. And coming up from this, the epistemological challenges about should we produce this knowledge in such form, or what is our responsibilities as a researchers in front of the society in such situation. Yes, I'm skipping lots of text, sorry. So what I was thinking while including this slide to the presentation is about our readership. For whom do we as social scientists produce this knowledge about the war? And in case of SEDOS, it was also one of the discussions that happened in our team because we didn't expect it. And the situation happened when we had to publish our research report in a very limited time. So we published it on the 31st of March 2022. And we had to publish it in Ukrainian and English. And we had a discussion, should we do the same text in two languages? Or maybe we should modify the text a bit because it goes for different readership, for different audience. And some things are like more contextual to Ukrainians. It started from that because the question was that something which is understandable for Ukrainians, in English we just had to add some more context as a footnote or something. And if we alter the text, it will be not the same text, it will be not the same report. Yes, so at the end, we published the same text. We decided that it will be a bit manipulative and playing with the audience, playing with the readership, if we literally put different accents in different texts. But these discussions exist. And it is always a question of balancing the emotional and the analytical. And also, like, having in mind this question, for whom do I write or publish or speak with my research? Another example is that's from like this research project I'm doing. One of my informants told me quite an unpleasant story about her complicated relationship with her landlady in Berlin. And since Berlin housing crisis, it's very hard to get another apartment or so. And I felt, of course, I never share the details precisely, and I'm trying to make people, it is also one of the things I'm trying to do with keeping the voice of my informant distinguishable and narrow, but also not to disclose too much of the personal details, of course, and not to make a person recognizable. But this story came up when I was writing a column for Die Zeit about the housing for Ukrainian refugees in Berlin and solidarity and so on. And at some point I realized that actually her landlady can recognize herself in that situation because, yes, she's actually the audience, the readership of the Zeit. And that might actually impact the overall life situation of this person, of my informant, which is absolutely like the last thing I want to do. But I really want to share this story, and I'm still not decided how it will be wrapped up. So, and also it is incredibly important for us as researchers to recognize the power we hold in shaping understandings of the war. And to wrap up all these open questions about research, about the war, it is also one of the most pressuring questions for me is a question of expertise and the people behind the knowledge production. I'm speaking from the position of a Ukrainian who firstly was in Ukraine and did a research in Ukraine about Ukraine, and then became a Ukrainian in Germany doing the research about Ukrainians in Germany. So I'm kind of representative of the community I'm talking about. But this is not quite the thing in Western academia. And I really love the title of a blog by Neil Abrams from last year, Dear Illustrious Professors of International Relations, Stop Talking About Ukraine. Because that was a very big thing, especially in the beginning of the full-scale war, when everyone was talking about Ukraine. And everyone suddenly realized that they can be experts about Ukraine because they are experts on Cold War, they are experts on international economical relations and gas pipelines throughout Europe. So everyone was talking about Ukraine. And sometimes to such extent that Ukrainians were excluded from the talks, and it's also my personal experience. When I reached out to some people with whom I worked before, they reached out to me and invited me to speak about Ukraine. And it was the beginning of the full-scale war, and said, like, you know, I cannot guarantee that I can be in Zoom at that time because internet and bomb shelter is not actually that well. And at the end, like in some hours, I received a reply that, oh, you know, actually, we don't need your comments. And then I have seen the recording of that panel of 5 people, 1 female, and 4 white non-Ukrainian men, experts in international relations, talking about the actual situation in Ukraine. And that was a bit weird situation, so I kind of made it my thing that when I'm here, when I'm in Germany, when I can, I always speak about Ukraine. Yeah, and but it is also tricky because also coming from Ukraine to Germany 2 years ago in the spring, I had lots of invitations to speak about. But at some point, I realized that I'm invited to events that actually have nothing to do with my expertise. Because the other side of the medal is that I'm invited because I'm Ukrainian and female, nice on the panel. And at some point, I was sitting on the panel about some economical issues, and I realized that I have nothing to say about. And here, my Ukrainianness overshadows my own expertise. And this is also a challenge for us as social scientists, because I doubt that if I was marine biologist, I would be invited to the events about economics in Ukraine. But as social scientists, we're not seen, sometimes we are not seen for our expertise, mostly for the fact that we experienced at the war. And, but at the same time, what happened and what I see as a very positive sign now, that Ukrainian researchers also become more visible in Western academia, as many of us have arrived, many of us had some connections, many of us have projects now. But what I'm also trying to highlight all the time is that there are even more researchers who remained in Ukraine. and they are still there, they are still working, they are doing amazing job and amazing research, and unfortunately they are mostly seen as suppliers of empirical data by Western academia, but not the knowledge co-producers. And coming back to the point about balancing the perspectives of insiders and outsiders, I see it as extremely important to include Ukrainian practice partners as equal producers of knowledge, not just suppliers or someone who can share something. And this comes along with all the discussion about decolonizing of knowledge production and so on. And the thing is, the final point with which I would like to conclude is, actually, it's the title of the special issue of the Journal of International Relations and Development, to which we contributed, is the right to remain silent for us as researchers. And the question is that sometimes, like in our case with CEDAS, the knowledge we produced, we did it not because of some academic knowledge and the desire to study something, but because we just felt that we do not have a right to be silent and sit aside the situation. And but also, as researchers, as people who are in power of producing the knowledge, we are also in power of shaping and shifting the narrative. And in case of Ukrainians, it is what I observe now, is that we have a right. There are lots of interests in Ukraine, in social science especially, and lots of projects will be coming, and lots of texts will be published and lectures will be given. But what I really aspire to see is the change of narrative from Ukrainians being the victims and research project into the traumatic experience, the traumatic past, and the terrible things that are happening in the country, to more empowering narrative about how Ukrainians can be resilient, what is going on, how Ukraine can be restored after the war. And honestly speaking, from a personal perspective, to me, it is something very inspiring when I see and hear about the projects of restoration of Ukraine, because that gives me as a person lots of hope that something will happen, that it's not that bad all the time, and probably it will be easier for the people doing their research to speak about something inspiring, not only about something traumatizing. And I really hope that, yeah, the literature on this will appear, knowledge will be co-produced fairly, even though there are so many questions to ask and to answer for ourselves at first when we are doing this research about the war and from the perspective of the war. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lazarenko, for this practical meditation on probably the question of voice and positionality, and the question who can produce authoritative knowledge and who should produce authoritative knowledge about war. I would like to hand over immediately to the floor. I have some questions prepared, but perhaps somebody is already inspired. And the gentleman over there, please.
I will just quickly say something about my background so you can understand my question better. I myself come from, or my parents come from Bosnia-Herzegovina. As a lot of you know, there's been a horrible war there as well. And there's still a crisis situation right now. And I always see a lot of parallels between these conflicts. And I felt a lot what you were saying about epistemological inequalities, about people being very loud, speaking very loudly, that maybe should be a bit more silent or listen to the people who are actually from there, and about the researchers who aren't heard and anything like that. And I was just wondering if there are, if in your research, if you saw that people were aware of experiences of other peoples in conflicts earlier, or is there any working together on scientific basis with Bosnia or with any other conflict in that matter? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, of course, there is lots of literature written about other conflicts, and especially the conflict, the multiple conflicts on Balkans. And the co-editor of the edited volume for all of this reflection, she is actually coming from Kosovo, and she had her personal stories of being a Kosovan researcher working in Belgium in a university, and also, yeah, there is a lot of literature, and especially, like, I would say in feminist ethnography since 1990s, the quote from Liane Fuji was from there. Yeah, this research is being done, but also because such research is mostly done by people coming from other nations, their voices are less audible because there are always people who are louder and who are experts on everything and can comment on everything. And that's why we need to speak up and to elevate our voices. Yeah.
There to the left, yes.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you a lot for your presentation. I have 2 points that I would like to have a conversation with you about, because the first point you were talking about deciding whether or not to include the fact that some of your survey respondents are afraid of being mobilized to fight the Russians. And I would like you to say more about what was the final decision that you actually made, and how you came to that decision, because this dilemma reminded me of, I'm not sure if it was a paper or a column written by a sociologist from Hong Kong. I am from Hong Kong, by the way. And the study was about, he was studying why people during the protests in 2019 and 2020 decided to go on the front lines and be militant. And the sort of beautiful answer, the answer you expect would be sense of injustice or indignation and all that. But he, in the end, published also details about how people liked that, going on the front lines, they felt brave, or they even, they met other people who they, okay, how do I put this? During that time in the protest movement, it was more attractive to be in those positions, and maybe some people were going out there to get girls. There were informants saying that, and he did end up publishing that, and in some sense showing that multitude of layers of the protesters is a great thing academically, but also it reflects badly on the movement, so to say. And it almost becomes a question of whether this kind of research, especially in the moment, should serve the movement or the war effort in that sense. So I really want to hear more about what you say. And the point about epistemology, when you talk about Western scholars, experts in international relations commenting on Ukraine, the person who pops into my mind immediately is Timothy Snyder. And I've no problem with him. I don't know how you think of what he's been saying or writing about Eastern Europe all this time. The first thing that I saw from him after the war started is his lecture series on the making of modern Ukraine, which for someone who hasn't studied about the region, and I don't speak Ukraine or Russian, and I can't really access first-hand sources, I found that very helpful for me. But now that I'm hearing your perspective, I really wonder what you think are the tensions. Thank you. Sorry for taking so much time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. Yeah, the first one about mobilization question. Actually, my colleagues decided not to include the answers and this issue into the report, because after long runs of talking about this topic because also we had it very mixed in our answers. Even though we focused that we are researching the impact of the war on the civilian population, we had the answers from the people who were on the front line. And this is the question, like in Ukrainian society, of course, it's a pending issue that some people don't want to be mobilized, some people are afraid to be mobilized. But the thing is also that there are lots of people who want to mobilize or who just see it as inevitable thing to happen to them. And if we might impact their decision on not to mobilize or to publish the strategies how people are trying to avoid being mobilized, that can impact someone's decision to do that. And also that can be hard to read for the people who are on the front line. And yeah, so we collected and stored all the information securely on the cloud servers. And the plan was to come back to this data when there will be, and if there will be an appropriate moment. And of course, it will be a great material to study, both why people wanted to join the army, because lots of them did. And when we had this question, what have you been doing in the first hours after the war has started, we had numerous answers. I was queuing in the line to the territorial complectation center to volunteer for the army. And we were thinking that we can probably do something with this data afterwards and, for instance, explore like push and pull factors in this question. And second question about Timothy Snyder, I would say that if I had to, if there can be only one white male Western professor speaking about Ukraine, let it be Timothy Snyder, because what he is doing is an amazing job, and he has been researching Ukraine for decades before it was a mainstream. And this lecture series that he recorded was actually done in a partnership with Ukrainian government. Because also, unfortunately, we live in the world of hierarchies and authorities. And when he is a professor of Yale University specializing in Ukraine, he gets this trust and this credibility. And so people, I don't know, somewhere in the middle of the Netherlands who want to know more about Ukraine, who have never heard much about Ukraine, can watch his lectures and understand like this perspective. And in his work, he's also popularizing the knowledge of less known Ukrainian authors and Ukrainian historians who are writing in Ukrainian. And he's also like spreading his thoughts. And he's quite critical and reflective about his own positionality on this topic. So, yeah, but of course it will be great if there will be more voices.
Any other questions? Yes, I see somebody else there.
Thank you. You mentioned that you didn't have any difficulties finding common ground between the survey participants and your interview partners and you yourself. So, of course, the people who talked to you knew that you were Ukrainian and a refugee, etc. I don't know if you even call yourself a refugee, yeah. or perhaps an expat, I don't know. So, my question is, did the topic of ethnic background, birthplace, passport, and political stance ever come up in the interview? Did you ever have the moment in which your interview partner asked you something that you had to answer because you couldn't not answer the question? And if so, did you feel the need to like withhold information? Or did you feel like you had to agree in this moment to not create a conflict, perhaps? Was the topic of even the language of the research itself? I'm assuming it was Ukrainian rather than Russian. But for example, what if one of the 12 single women was actually like a half Russian, let's say, and she said, well, I actually don't speak Ukrainian at all or barely at all. So how did you react with that, and how did you transform it into your research?
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions. Actually, yes, not all the interviews were in Ukrainian. 4 three took place entirely in Russian, and one started in Ukrainian, and then we switched to Russian, because it was easier for people, and some are coming from Russian-speaking regions, Russian-speaking cities, Russian-speaking families, and it is also a point I reflect on, and some were saying like, oh, I'm so sorry, I don't speak Ukrainian properly, but I'm trying, but it is hard for me because I never used it in my private life, but I'm trying. Somewhere, because these are women of different age, up to 65. So 19 to 65 at the moment of 2022. And yes, for people of older age, it's mostly for them it was harder to transition, and yes, I was flexible with that because, yeah, to me it is whatever language the person is comfortable with, that's it. Another thing is that I am also fighting my feeling of certain guilt and my own privileges, because lots of my informants are dependent on social benefits, and their life situation is not as mine. I have a contract with the university. I can, yeah, I have a bit different life than they have. And yes, sometimes once it happened that a person asked me how much do I get with my salary. And yes, I had to answer that, yes, it is like this. And I need to fight this inner feeling that I am too privileged to ask them about their struggles with job center and money allowance and everything. And yeah, this is a bit challenging. This was a bit challenging. But with interviews, you never know to which direction it is going. Also with the language, the ones that we had to switch to Russian, because it was an interview that lasted for more than 4 hours. I had other plans, but the person was just sharing her life with me. And we have met for coffee, and then at some point, it was her offer. She just said, like, that's such a tough topic, let's have some wine. Like, okay, maybe wine surely for me, because I'm at work. But then, yes, we were going on, and the person was sharing like her life story with me, and I didn't feel in a position to interrupt her and to say like, stop, I don't have time anymore. Of course, it was all off the record. But yeah, and at some point she just organically switched to Russian because that person is from Crimea. And she had a story also of double displacements and, yeah, hard narrating her experience. But this is just what happens. And I, as a researcher, I'm also a research tool as ethnographer.
Thank you so much. But my question was more in the direction of, did you also discuss the political attitudes towards the war itself? Was that a subject?
It was not a subject. It was not on the, on the agenda, not in my interview guide at all. And I assume that people who have come to Germany to safety are more or less on the same page in their political attitudes. That's, yeah.
All right. Any other questions at this point? Seeing none, I will ask some questions myself. First question that I wanted to ask is, so I had the pleasure of reading your paper, and your co-author, Marnie Howlett, well, or I want to say you didn't write the paper alone, you wrote it with a co-author. And then Marnie Howlett, if I'm not mistaken, that's an English name, it's a British name, but you said she has some Ukrainian roots too. And if I read then further in the paper, you say about yourself, of course, that you were living and working in Ukraine until 24th of February 2022. So you're Ukrainian, did all your studies there through and through. Whereas you write about the first author that she completed a 6-month ethnography prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you conclude by saying both of the countries, both of the authors have the perspective of insiders. So they identify with Ukraine, they identify as Ukrainians, they identify with the hardship and many of the things that happened there. And I was wondering, there is a stark difference in positionality between the two of you. I would say that you are more of an insider than she is. She is also from a global, working at well, the Humboldt University is wonderful, but she's in Oxford, which is a university some people may even know a bit better. So my question to you was, in terms of voice, positionality, hierarchy, objective, subjective, inside, outside, what is the how do you perceive this difference between you and your co-author, and how has that influenced your perspective on the ethics and the methodology and the epistemology of doing this research?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, my colleague, actually we co-wrote this paper before even meeting physically. And it was a series of exchanging contexts, and she comes from Canada, from a Ukrainian diaspora. And she has English name, but she has Ukrainian roots, and she speaks Ukrainian fluently. And yeah, she also had the thing of suddenly becoming an expert on everything about Ukraine, because she is Ukrainian in the University of Oxford. And she had the thing of doing interviews and a research project about ethnicities in Ukraine and between Ukrainian-Polish borderland, from where her family roots come. And it was her thing that the project just became irrelevant because no one was interested anymore in the project about Ukrainian-Polish borderlands when suddenly it became like half of the Poland became Ukrainian borderland to some extent, with the arrival of 2 million or almost 5 million of refugees have come through Poland in 2022. So yeah, it was, and actually she contacted me because she was thinking about these topics of producing knowledge and being personally related to Ukraine. And she contacted me because of this SEDOS research and proposed to co-author a paper about this. And now she's also working on Ukraine. And yeah, it was all her stories about ethical committees and the inability of doing a research at the same time. And at the University of Oxford, she was asked to supervise a survey project about Ukraine. As insider and as a Ukrainian native speaker who can look through the questionnaire and see that some things you just cannot ask people directly like that. So yeah, we were co-authors, but she also, as she is English native speaker, she helped me a lot with the text and with the writings, because yeah, it's still very hard to produce academic knowledge without having a peer reviewer and native speaker because of all these publication things that we have.
Okay, thank you. Looking back at the audience, any questions at this point? Then I'll go for, given the time, I'll go for another couple of ones. The Ukraine war is heavily mediatized. It's not, as such, in Western media, a forgotten war. I think one might say that Ukraine war is deemed systemic for global order. There's another war going on like that at the moment, the Gaza war. And for that reason, those wars are the subject of really very extensive media coverage. Whether they benefit or not, that will be part of my question for you. There's other wars, typically the last couple of years people have been pointing at Yemen, or for instance now at Sudan, that purely in terms of the human misery that is caused, those wars are actually larger. There's a bigger number of people displaced, the casualties and so on. But they're not as systemic to the West or to what we then call the global order, and so they are less covered in the media. So my question is, how do you think that the fact that the Ukraine war is so covered in the media that everybody has an opinion about it and has access to some information, influences you doing research on it and trying to frame or reframe or provide a different view of the matter? Do you think it's more necessary because it's so visible and everybody's misinformed, or do you think that to some extent you can start the conversation at a higher level, or how does that influence? Obviously, I know you haven't done research, I think on Sudan and Yemen and so on, but from your perspective, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, of course, this war is covered much more than all the other wars, especially Syrian war, which was also covered mostly in the terms of refugees and treatment and misery and procedures, because I was working on bureaucracy recently, and yeah, it was covered, but in a different way, and the war is still going on, but no one talks about Syria anymore. But in Ukraine, yes, and also because it happened out of a sudden to lots, it's what I hear a lot in being here in Germany. But for us, for Ukrainians, we say that the war has started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and advance on Donbass. And it is also one of the things that we are trying to, like me personally, in personal conversations, I always try to point out to these two, that for us, yes, it was unexpected, but not that much unexpected as for Western world. And yes, of course, everyone knows about Ukraine, everyone has an opinion about Ukraine, and as social scientists, we are also responding to certain public demand to know more about Ukraine and to re-establish the focuses in academic community, because what we call, what I see a lot in so-called regional studies, Eastern Europe was like a smaller department in a big department of Russian studies. And of course, in many associations everywhere, there were just more people studying Russia and about Russia. And that's why the knowledge about Ukraine was mostly framed in a colonial way and reflecting Russian narratives about Ukraine, that Ukraine is like minor brother and little brother of big Russian family of folks, like Soviet narrative. And now what is happening, what I see what is happening in the academic community is a bit of a shift of a focus, and there is more interest in Ukrainian studies. For instance, there is the first program on Ukrainian studies in Germany, established at Viadrina University, Frankfurt-Oder. And there are students from different countries who wish to study about Ukraine and who wish to learn the language and know more about the region with a focus on Ukraine, also to understand better why this conflict happens, that it is a continuation of 300 years long struggle and so on. But unfortunately, there are not too many material about Ukraine for the students to study, to comprise a whole course. That's why it is important to publish, to talk, to just see. And my work, what I'm doing now, is mostly connected to Ukrainian community in Germany and also outer, but that's work in progress. That's also the case how European countries responded to the arrival of Ukrainian refugees was unprecedented, and this practice should be, of course, improved, but also extrapolated, because we assume that Ukrainian war, the current war in Ukraine, is unfortunately not the last war that will cause the mass influx of refugees to European countries. And these practices can be also expanded for the somehow inevitable future crisis.
Okay, thank you. Having another look at the audience. Seeing no questions, I will ask a last question of myself, and then we can conclude. And it's a very specific question. I actually wanted to ask it before our director had to leave. Rumor has it that at some point we are closing down at this institute, but that also means that we'll be in business for a bit longer. And well, lots of your research is about who has the right to speak about Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and who has voice. Well, both the German research system and this institute has given you voice and authority to speak on the matter. And I was wondering if you could give some insight, can be very specific, very, very brief, on how, for instance, this institute, but also the German research system more broadly, what they could do for Ukrainian scholars.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Actually, this is something that is already happening in the organizations that are funding research on Ukraine. But it will be great if DFG, for instance, how it is, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, how that if they announce more calls for projects for Ukrainian, to produce the knowledge about Ukraine. And what I see as a very important thing is to make the cooperation between German universities and Ukrainian universities easier. With co-producing this knowledge, and yes, inviting Ukrainian researchers to share their expertise, not only to provide the data, collect the data, but also be equal partners in doing this research on the field. Because, yeah, the problem is also, even if I really wanted to do the field work in Ukraine now, I cannot do it being affiliated with a German university. I'm just not allowed to travel there for business trips. And when I travel to Ukraine, I even need to sign out of my insurance and say that, yes, I'm going there where I will not be covered. So for German scholars, that's complicated, but it opens the door to include more perspective of Ukrainians who are still in Ukraine and doing their research. So that will be, such partnerships will be a great asset.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lazarenko. Then we've come to the end of the lecture. On the 3rd of July, there is the final lecture in the lecture series. Valentin Veneberg is coming about the topic, he's going to talk about the topic Militair Dienstverweigerung als Asylgrund. And he's going to talk with my colleague Laura Affolter. So we expect all of you. Then if you have some personal questions for Dr. Lazarenko, I'm sure she will be available for any direct questions after the end of the talk. Thank you very much. I wish you a very good evening. Enjoy the good weather, and see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.